My dear reader, there are moments in a man's life when instinct whispers its warning long before reason assembles its proofs. I experienced such a moment on a fog-choked evening in late November, when the gas lamps of Blackfriars burned like drowning stars and the city seemed to hold its breath. We had not expected a visitor. Abraham Jonathan Blackwood and I were seated opposite one another in his chambers, number 17 Crowhurst Lane, a narrow street that bent away from the Thames like a guilty thought from the mind. A coal fire murmured softly between us. Blackwood, long-limbed and motionless, sat with his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, his steel-gray eyes fixed not upon me, nor the flames, but upon some internal problem invisible to all others. It was then that the bell rang. Not once, not twice, but with a single deliberate pull, firm, patient, unhurried. Blackwood's eyes shifted toward the door. "That," he said quietly, "is no casual caller, Harrington." The door opened, and the woman who entered did not blink. Before I proceed, it is only just that I place before you a clear image of the man whose intellect would soon be tested against a darkness unlike any we had previously encountered. Abraham Jonathan Blackwood stood just over 6 feet, though he seemed taller due to a severe leanness that gave him the aspect of a man carved rather than born. His hair, once jet black, had begun to surrender to streaks of iron gray at the temples, brushed back with military precision. His face was long and angular, dominated by a sharp aquiline nose and eyes of such pale intensity that many found them unsettling. He dressed plainly, almost austerely, dark frock coats, high collars without ornament, boots polished but never ostentatious. Yet there was nothing unremarkable about him. His stillness was not passive, it was predatory. Like a spider upon its web, Blackwood moved only when purpose demanded. To the casual observer he might appear cold. To those who knew him, he was dangerous. As for myself, I am a physician by training and inclination, broader in frame than my companion, with a temperament better suited to human sympathy than relentless analysis. Where Blackwood dissected motive, I tended wounds, both physical and unseen. My role, as ever, was chronicler, conscience, and occasional restraint upon his more merciless deductions. Together, we had faced murderers, frauds, and madmen, but nothing had prepared us for the asylum that did not speak. The woman removed her gloves slowly, methodically, as though performing a ritual. She was of middle height, dressed in mourning black that seemed older than fashion itself. Her face was pale, unnaturally so, and framed by dark hair drawn tightly beneath her bonnet. What struck me most was not her appearance, but her eyes. They were open, wide, unblinking. Blackwood gestured to the chair nearest the fire. "Please," he said gently, "sit down, madam. You are safe here." She obeyed. For several seconds she said nothing. Then, in a voice devoid of tremor or warmth, she spoke. "My name is Eleanor Whitcomb. I do not know where I have been for the last 3 years, and I believe someone is erasing people." The fire cracked sharply, as though in protest. Blackwood did not move. "Go on," he said. "I was declared dead in 1897, buried, mourned, forgotten, and yet here I am." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "How," I asked carefully, "does one survive one's own burial?" She turned to me for the first time. Her gaze was empty. "Because," she said, "the dead are very quiet where I came from." Blackwood leaned forward now, his eyes fixed upon her hands. "You say your shoes were taken, your journals, your name,
And yet you remember these details with remarkable clarity." She nodded. "There were rules." "What sort of rules?" "No mirrors, no writing implements, no clocks, no calendars, and above all, no speaking after lights out." "Punishment?" Blackwood asked. "Correction," she replied. The words sat heavily between us. Blackwood arose and approached her, stopping just short of invading her personal space. He gestured gently toward her sleeve. "May I?" She inclined her arm. He lifted the cuff. Beneath the black fabric, faint but unmistakable, were parallel white scars, thin as quill scratches, running horizontally across the skin. Restraints, not crude, clinical.
I felt a familiar, helpless anger rise within me, the physician's fury at suffering administered with method. "These marks," Blackwood said softly, "were not made by ordinary manacles. The spacing suggests a fixed apparatus, something designed not to bruise, but to immobilize." She withdrew her arm without protest. "They did not want us damaged," she said. "They wanted us quiet." Blackwood returned to his chair. "You were released," he said. "How?" "I awoke one morning, and the door was unlocked." "And no one stopped you?" "No." "No guards? No attendants? No questions?" She shook her head. "I walked out. My clothes were folded neatly on a chair. Money was placed in my pocket. My name was written on a card, spelled correctly for the first time in years. That," Blackwood said, "is not how institutions behave." "No," she agreed. "It is how experiments conclude." A shiver passed through me. "You believe others were held there?" I asked. "I know it." "Names?" She closed her eyes. "When one is deprived of speech long enough," she said, "names become dangerous. But I remember faces, and I remember this." She opened her eyes. "Everyone who entered before me was already officially dead." The implication struck like a blow. "Then why come to us now?" Blackwood asked. Her gaze hardened. "Because," she said, "people are still being buried who have not yet learned how to survive silence." For several moments, Blackwood said nothing. He rose, crossed to the window, and parted the curtain just enough to peer into the fog-bound street below. "An unregistered asylum," Blackwood said at last. "Patients officially deceased. Clinical restraint. Controlled release." He turned. "This is not madness," he said quietly. "It is administration." He faced her fully now. "Miss Whitcomb, someone has built a place where the law does not need to look, because it believes it already has." She nodded. "I believe," she said, "that you are the first man who understands that." Blackwood's mouth curved, not into a smile, but into something far colder. "Then," he said, "we shall make the law look again." It was nearly midnight when Miss Eleanor Whitcomb departed our chambers, yet the impression she left behind lingered with the stubborn persistence of a funeral bell echoing long after the last toll. Blackwood watched her from the window as she disappeared into the fog, her black figure dissolving as though the city itself were swallowing her back into secrecy. "She walks," he observed quietly, "like someone who has learned that attention is dangerous." I said nothing. My thoughts were already racing ahead, to locked wards, to silent corridors, to lives suspended between breath and burial. When Blackwood turned back into the room, his expression had shifted into that particular severity I had come to associate with only the gravest cases. "Harrington," he said, "bring the ledger." I fetched it at once. It was a massive volume, bound in cracked leather and smelling faintly of dust and camphor, the Register of Metropolitan Death Certificates, which Blackwood maintained with a diligence bordering on obsession.
Every unusual death, contradiction, or legal anomaly we encountered found its way into those pages. He turned the leaves slowly. "Eleanor Whitcomb," he murmured. The pencil paused. "There," he said. He angled the book toward me. "Certificate number 11,784. Whitcomb, Eleanor. Declared deceased, 14 February 1897. Cause of death, acute melancholia, leading to self-inflicted asphyxiation. Place of death, St. Bartholomew's Receiving House. Attending physician, Dr. Lionel Graves. Disposition, interred at Highgate Cemetery." I stared at the page. "Melancholia," I said bitterly, "the word physicians use when they wish to avoid precision." Blackwood nodded. "And note this," he said, topping the margin. "There is no mention of family presence at identification." "That is irregular," I said. "At minimum, a relative should have been summoned, unless the body was never intended to be seen." He closed the ledger. "Come," he said, "we are going to a cemetery." Highgate Cemetery at night is not a place for contemplation. It is a place where certainty erodes. The iron gates groaned open under Blackwood's key, and we stepped into a landscape of leaning stones and skeletal yews. The fog hung low, pooling around the tombs like something poured deliberately to conceal. Blackwood carried a lantern, its glow carved trembling halos across engraved names, names of men and women who had died properly, irrevocably. "Until now." He stopped. "This one," he said. The stone was unremarkable. No angel, no verse, just "Eleanor Whitcomb, beloved daughter, 1897. No birth year, no epitaph of comfort. I knelt. The soil was undisturbed. "No subsidence," I said. "No evidence of collapse." Blackwood crouched beside me, his gloved fingers brushing frost from the stone. "A grave that has never been used," he said. A wind stirred the fog. "Then what was buried?" I asked. Blackwood straightened slowly. "Paper," he replied. "Ink, and the willingness of society to accept an answer that requires no further thought." We did not sleep that night. By dawn, Blackwood had located Dr. Lionel Graves, formerly attached to St. Bartholomew's Receiving House, now retired to a narrow residence near Hampstead Hitch. The man who opened the door was a ruin. His hands shook visibly. His eyes, once sharp if the old portraits were to be believed, now flickered with perpetual anxiety. When Blackwood introduced himself, Graves went pale. "I have nothing to say," he muttered. "You signed a death certificate for a woman who is living," Blackwood replied calmly. Graves recoiled as though struck. "That is impossible," he whispered. Blackwood stepped forward. "She stood in my rooms last night." The silence that followed was profound. Graves sagged against the doorframe. "Oh God," he breathed. "Then it has begun again." Inside, the house smelled of disinfectant and fear. Graves sat with his head in his hands. "They told us," he hoarsely said, "that it was a new method, humane, progressive, a place where the incurable would be studied, not punished." "Studied by whom?" I asked. He shook his head violently. "No names, never names." Blackwood's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. "You certified deaths that did not occur." "Yes." "You falsified causes." "Yes." "You enabled disappearances." Graves looked up at us, tears streaking his face. "They said it was necessary," he whispered, "that society required quiet solutions." Blackwood leaned closer. "And the asylum?" he asked. Graves swallowed. "There was no name," he said, "only a number." He hesitated. Then, barely audible, "Ward 0. Graves suddenly clutched his ears. "Do you hear it?" he cried. We listened. There was nothing. "No," I said gently. Graves shook his head in terror. "It starts like that," he whispered. "The silence. Then—" He stopped. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Then what?" Graves stared at him. "Then," he said, "you begin to hear your own thoughts screaming. There are places that decay honestly. Their windows shatter, their doors sag. Ivy claims their walls, and time announces its victory openly. And then there are places that remain intact, not because they are loved, but because they are still useful." Such was the building Blackwood and I approached on morning of December 2nd. It stood several miles beyond the city's proper edge, where the streets lost their names and became mere tracks of hardened mud. The carriage driver would go no further. "Government land," he muttered. "Nothing there but ghosts." Blackwood paid him without comment. The fog here was heavier than in London, unmoving, as though trapped by the land itself. Through it, the structure emerged slowly, brick by brick, window by window, until the full outline stood before us. A former asylum, officially closed in 1889, yet the iron gates were oiled, the gravel path was freshly raked, and the front doors bore no sign of rot. "No vandalism," I murmured. Blackwood touched the stone beside the entrance. "No neglect," he replied. "Only discretion." The plaque beside the door had been removed, but not violently. Its bolts were cleanly withdrawn, the surface beneath scrubbed pale, as though the building had politely—
The doors yielded at once. Inside, the temperature dropped, not sharply but decisively. The air smelled faintly of carbolic soap and something else beneath it, old breath, trapped too long. Our footsteps sounded wrong, muted, not absorbed by dust, but smothered, as though the walls themselves resisted noise. I halted. "Blackwood," I whispered, "do you hear that?" He did not answer immediately. Then, slowly, "I hear nothing at all." That was the problem. Even abandoned buildings speak. They creak, they sigh, they groan beneath their own weight. This place did none of that. The silence was deliberate, engineered. We passed wards where iron bedsteads stood neatly aligned, their mattresses intact, their sheets folded with institutional precision. Not one was stained, not one bore the marks of struggle. "These were not sleeping rooms," I said quietly. "No," Blackwood agreed. "They were storage. For people? For behaviors." We entered a central corridor that stretched farther than the exterior dimensions should have allowed. The gas lamps along the walls were unlit, but clean, their glass polished regularly. I struck a match. The flame burned steadily. No draft. Blackwood stopped abruptly. He stamped his foot. Nothing echoed. "This corridor," he said, "has been treated." Treated how? He removed a small pocket knife and tapped the wall. The sound was dead. "Layers," he said. "Felt, cork, horsehair, plaster, possibly rubberized fabric beneath." I felt a tightening in my chest. "Soundproofing," I said. "Yes," he replied, "not to protect patients from noise, but to protect others from hearing them." The door at the corridor's end bore no marking, no number, no handle, only a narrow slit at eye level, fitted with thick glass. Blackwood leaned forward. I followed. Behind the glass was darkness, absolute. Then, movement. Something shifted, slowly. I stepped back involuntarily. Blackwood did not. He struck the door once with his knuckles. The vibration traveled up my arm and died instantly. Inside the darkness, a shape approached the slit. A face appeared. The eyes were open, too open. The mouth opened, and no sound emerged. The figure raised a finger, not to its lips, but upward, a warning. Then it tapped, once, twice, 3 times, paused, then again. Blackwood inhaled sharply. "Morse," he whispered. I strained to follow. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap. Blackwood's face had gone very still. "It's spelling," he said, with effort. He leaned closer to the glass. "What does it say?" I asked. His voice was barely audible. "Do not answer when they speak." The gaslight flickered. Behind us, a sound. Soft, measured. Footsteps. Approaching from the corridor we had just traversed. Blackwood straightened. "Someone is here," I whispered. "Yes," he said calmly, "and they believe this building is empty." The footsteps stopped. A voice followed. Pleasant, cultivated, male. "Gentlemen," it said, echoing just enough to be intentional, "you are trespassing on a facility that does not officially exist." Blackwood turned slowly. "Then," he replied, "you will not object to us leaving with what we have found." There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "I am afraid," the voice said, "that silence must be preserved." The voice behind us was not raised. That, more than anything else, unnerved me. Men who shout wish to be heard. Men who whisper wish to be obeyed. The footsteps resumed, unhurried, each one placed with careful consideration, as though the man wished us to understand that haste had no place here. Blackwood remained motionless, his back straight, his hands loosely clasped behind him. The figure emerged from the fog of the corridor. He was tall, spare, and impeccably dressed in a dark coat whose cut suggested custom tailoring rather than institutional issue. His hair was silvered prematurely, brushed back from a forehead marked with the faint lines of habitual concentration. He wore no hat. Which struck me immediately was his expression. It was not hostile, it was evaluative. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. "I am Dr. Alastair Monroe." The name meant nothing to me. Blackwood inclined his head slightly. "You will forgive us, Doctor, for intruding upon your solitude." Monroe smiled faintly. "Solitude," he said, glancing around the corridor, "is an unfortunate word. This place is quite full." My skin prickled. "Of whom?" I asked. He regarded me with polite curiosity. "Of outcomes," he said. Dr. Monroe gestured down the corridor, as though conducting us through a gallery rather than confronting trespassers. "You have noticed the walls," he said. "Most visitors do. Sound is a terribly inefficient medium for communication. It excites, it agitates. Silence, on the other hand, invites introspection." Blackwood's eyes flicked briefly towards the slit in the door of Ward 0. "And resistance?" he asked. Monroe followed his gaze. "Ah," he said softly, "that." He approached the door and rested 2 fingers lightly against the glass. The doors yielded at once. Inside, the temperature dropped, not sharply but decisively. The air smelled faintly of carbolic soap and something else beneath it. Old breath, trapped too long. Our footsteps sounded wrong, muted, not absorbed by dust, but smothered, as though the walls themselves resisted noise. I halted. "Blackwood," I whispered, "do you hear that?" He did not answer immediately. Then, slowly, "I hear nothing at all." That was the problem. Even abandoned buildings speak. They creak, they sigh, they groan beneath their own weight. This place did none of that. The silence was deliberate, engineered. We passed wards where iron bedsteads stood neatly aligned, their mattresses intact, their sheets folded with institutional precision. Not one was stained, not one bore the marks of struggle. These were not sleeping rooms, I said quietly. No, Blackwood agreed. They were storage. For people? For behaviors. We entered a central corridor that stretched farther than the exterior dimensions should have allowed. The gas lamps along the walls were unlit, but clean, their glass polished regularly. I struck a match. The flame burned steadily. No draft. Blackwood stopped abruptly. He stamped his foot. Nothing echoed. "This corridor," he said, "has been treated." Treated how? He removed a small pocket knife and tapped the wall. The sound was dead. "Layers," he said. "Felt, cork, horsehair, plaster, possibly rubberized fabric beneath." I felt a tightening in my chest. "Soundproofing," I said. "Yes," he replied, "not to protect patients from noise, but to protect others from hearing them." The door at the corridor's end bore no marking, no number, no handle, only a narrow slit at eye level, fitted with thick glass. Blackwood leaned forward. I followed. Behind the glass was darkness, absolute. Then, movement. Something shifted, slowly. I stepped back involuntarily. Blackwood did not. He struck the door once with his knuckles. The vibration traveled up my arm and died instantly. Inside the darkness, a shape approached the slit. A face appeared. The eyes were open, too open. The mouth opened, and no sound emerged. The figure raised a finger, not to its lips, but upward, a warning. Then it tapped, once, twice, 3 times, paused, then again. Blackwood inhaled sharply. "Morse," he whispered. I strained to follow. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap. Blackwood's face had gone very still. "It's spelling," he said, with effort. He leaned closer to the glass. "What does it say?" I asked. His voice was barely audible. "Do not answer when they speak." The gaslight flickered. Behind us, a sound. Soft, measured. Footsteps. Approaching from the corridor we had just traversed. Blackwood straightened. "Then you have made a grave miscalculation." "Oh," Monroe said mildly. "You have allowed me to observe," Blackwood replied, "and observation is the enemy of secrecy." For the first time, Monroe's smile faded. "You misunderstand your position," he said. "This institution exists precisely because observation can be neutralized." Blackwood met his gaze evenly. "Then," he said, "you have underestimated the persistence of truth." Behind us, from somewhere deep within the building, a sound. A single involuntary sob. Monroe froze. His composure cracked. Not much, but enough. "That," Blackwood said softly, "is not silence." The sob did not repeat itself. That was its cruelty. A scream would have announced rebellion, a shout would have invited response, but a sob, singular, involuntary, unfinished, was a sound that suggested the mind had momentarily betrayed the discipline imposed upon it, and then, in fear of punishment, recoiled. The corridor seemed to inhale. Dr. Monroe stood perfectly still, his back rigid, the burned match still pinched between his fingers. The flame guttered, spat once, and died, leaving us suspended in darkness so complete that I could no longer distinguish wall from air. "You heard nothing," Monroe said. His voice was measured, but its edges had lost their polish. Blackwood did not answer. Instead, he closed the door toward Zero with deliberate care, the latch clicking into place with a sound far louder than it had any right to be. In the absence of ambient noise, even our breathing seemed obscene. I heard grief, Blackwood said at last, unprocessed, untreated. Monroe turned. You heard a reflex, the last twitch of an obsolete faculty. I felt my hands curl into fists. Grief, I said, is not obsolete. Monroe looked at me then, truly looked at me, for the first time. Dr. Harrington, he said, you still believe the mind is sacred. I swallowed. I believe, I replied, that it remembers. As we resumed walking, I became aware of something deeply unsettling. The silence was no longer empty, it was attentive. Every step we took seemed to ripple outward, as though the walls themselves were tuned instruments, waiting for resonance. I noticed faint irregularities in the padding, slight indentations where bodies had leaned, pressed, or struck out in moments of despair. Some bore fingernail marks, some bore teeth. Monroe spoke again, more quickly now. Extended sensory deprivation produces remarkable compliance. Within weeks, subjects cease to initiate thought. Within months, they relinquish identity. By the third month, a sound interrupted him. Not a sob, a word. It was barely audible, more breath than sound, a syllable stripped of confidence. Help. I felt my heart hammer against my ribs. Monroe froze. Slowly, he turned toward a door halfway down the corridor, a door identical to all the others, except for a faint scratch near its handle, as though someone had repeatedly reached for escape and failed. That is impossible, he said. Blackwood tilted his head slightly. No, he replied. It is inevitable. The door opened inward. The room beyond was dimly lit by a narrow skylight choked with grime. Dust motes hung motionless in the air, undisturbed by any current. In the center of the room sat a woman. She was not restrained. That, more than anything, unsettled me. Her hands rested neatly in her lap, her posture composed. Her eyes, too alert, too aware, tracked Monroe's movements with careful calculation. She smiled. The expression was faint, incomplete, but unmistakably intentional. "Good morning, Doctor," she said. Her voice was hoarse, as though unused, but it held shape, grammar, memory. Monroe's face drained of color. "You are not scheduled for reintroduction," he said. She tilted her head. "I reintroduced myself," she replied. Blackwood stepped forward. "What is your name?" he asked gently. The woman hesitated. The pause stretched. I could see the effort behind her eyes, the strain of dragging language back from wherever it had been buried. "Clara, I think," she said at last. Monroe backed away. "That is not possible," he whispered. Clara smiled again, this time with something sharp behind it. "You taught us that silence forces the mind inward." She leaned forward a slight. "You did not consider," she continued, "what we might find there." From down the corridor came another sound, then another. A cough, a murmur, a laugh, short, hysterical, quickly smothered. Doors began to tremble, not violently, but insistently, as if hands had been waiting just long enough for permission to remember themselves. Monroe's breathing became audible. "This facility is compromised," he said. Blackwood did not move. "No," he replied calmly. "It is awakening." Clara rose to her feet. Her movements were stiff, imperfect, but purposeful. "They told us that silence would cure us," she said quietly. She looked at Monroe. "But silence," she continued, "only teaches you how loudly you've been screaming inside." The lights flickered. Somewhere, glass shattered, and from every direction, voices. Not shouting, not yet, but remembering. The first word spoken was not loud. It was not even clear, but it was alive. It slid into the corridor like blood into water, thin at first, almost apologetic, yet impossible to ignore once perceived. The walls, which for so long absorbed sound without reply, seemed suddenly unprepared to contain it. Cold. The voice came from behind a door 3 paces to my left. Another followed, closer. I don't remember when. A chair scraped somewhere in the distance. The sound was grotesquely ordinary. Dr. Monroe staggered back a step, as though the corridor itself had struck him. His composure, so carefully curated, now revealed its fragility. Sweat glistened at his temples. His hands trembled, though he clenched them tightly at his sides, as if discipline alone might restore the world he had designed. "This is regression," he said sharply, "a temporary surge. The mind panics when reintroduced to stimulus." Blackwood's eyes moved from door to door, listening, not merely hearing, but interpreting. "No," he said calmly, "this is recollection." One door opened, then another, not flung wide, but eased open carefully, like the opening of old books long sealed away. A man stepped into the corridor. He was barefoot. His hospital garments hung loosely from a frame once stronger, now thinned by time and deprivation. His beard grew in uneven patches, as though it had forgotten its purpose. But his eyes were furious with awareness. He blinked against the light. "I was a printer," he said abruptly. No one had asked. "I printed pamphlets, labor reform. They said I was disruptive." He looked at his hands. "I remember the ink. God help me, I remember the smell of it." Another patient emerged, older, hunched, clutching her head as though it might fracture under the weight of returning thought. "They told me my husband died," she murmured. "But I see his face now. I see it." Her voice cracked. "He used to hum when he shaved."
The corridor filled, not with noise, with testimony. "This is dangerous," Monroe said, his voice breaking its own rules of composure. "Extended recollection causes psychotic fracture. They will tear themselves apart." "Or," Blackwood replied quietly, "they will reconstruct what you dismantled." Clara stood beside him now. Her breathing was uneven. Each inhalation looked like labor, as though her lungs had to relearn their task. "When the mind goes quiet," she said, "it does not sleep." She pressed her fingers to her temple. "It digs." Monroe's gaze snapped to her. "You are an anomaly," he said, "a statistical failure." Clara met his stare without flinching. "No," she said. "I am the control group." Somewhere above us, a bell began to ring. Not the scheduled chime of routine, but a warning bell, old and unused, its sound warped with rust and neglect. Footsteps thundered on the upper floors. Orderlies shouted. Keys clattered to the floor. Then, a scream. It came from staff quarters, not a patient. A man ran past us, coat flapping wildly, eyes wide with terror. "They're talking!" he cried. "They're all talking!" Blackwood placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "They always were," he said. "You simply stopped listening." The man wrenched free and fled. Monroe turned slowly in place, as though surveying the ruins of a cathedral only he had believed eternal. "I saved them! I spared them chaos!" Blackwood stepped closer. "No," he said gently. "You spared yourself dissent." From the far end of the corridor came a voice unlike the others. Clear, measured, educated. "Dr. Monroe!" it called. We all turned. An elderly man stood framed in a doorway marked Ward 0. He was tall still, despite age. His posture bore the memory of authority. His hair was white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes burned with unbroken intellect. "I was a barrister," he said calmly. "You kept me for 4 months, longer than your projections allowed." He smiled thinly. "I spent that time rehearsing." Monroe's lips parted. "You cannot testify," he said weakly. "Your records—" "Were falsified," the man finished. "Yes, you taught me the value of repetition." He took one step forward. "So, I repeated myself." The lights went out. For one terrible heartbeat, the asylum vanished into darkness. And then, every door opened at once.
The asylum was no longer just a building. It had become a living witness, breathing through cracked walls, shivering under the weight of decades of silence, and exhaling the memories of its victims. The corridor stretched endlessly, as if it had extended itself overnight, warping in angles and dimensions that should have been impossible. The flickering gas lamps cast grotesque shadows, merging patience with walls, merging memory with structure. Every step echoed, but not in uniform rhythm. It bounced, rebounded, and whispered of corners that did not exist yesterday. Blackwood's boots made no sound on the warped floorboards, yet I could feel the vibration of his presence, as though the building itself acknowledged his authority. His long coat, dark and precise, rippled slightly with each movement. The faint scent of tobacco lingered in his wake, mingling with the antiseptic and the metallic tang of old blood. He paused, eyes scanning the walls, taking in the subtle stains, scratches, and forgotten marks, each a narrative of suffering and suppressed rebellion. Clara clutched my arm. Her knuckles were pale, pressing hard into the fabric of my sleeve. "It's too quiet here now," she whispered. But the quiet was deceptive. It roared beneath the surface, a subterranean river of whispers, mutters, and soft footsteps that refused to be hushed. A sudden crash echoed from Ward 3, the sound of wood splintering, chairs overturned, and a metallic clang that resonated with unnerving precision. A man ran past us, naked from the waist up, hands clawing at the air as though the very walls were trying to catch him. "They're talking!" he cried. "They're all talking!" Blackwood placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "They always were," he said. "You simply stopped listening." The man wrenched free and fled. Monroe turned slowly in place, as though surveying the ruins of a cathedral only he had believed eternal. "I saved them! I spared them chaos!" Blackwood stepped closer. "No," he said gently. "You spared yourself dissent." From the far end of the corridor came a voice unlike the others. Clear, measured, educated. "Dr. Monroe!" it called. We all turned. An elderly man stood framed in a doorway marked Ward 0. He was tall still, despite age. His posture bore the memory of authority. His hair was white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes burned with unbroken intellect. "I was a barrister," he said calmly. "You kept me for 4 months, longer than your projections allowed." He smiled thinly. "I spent that time rehearsing." Monroe's lips parted. "You cannot testify," he said weakly. "Your records—" "Were falsified," the man finished. "Yes, you taught me the value of repetition." He took one step forward. "So, I repeated myself." The lights went out. For one terrible heartbeat, the asylum vanished into darkness. And then, every door opened at once. The asylum was no longer just a building. It had become a living witness, breathing through cracked walls, shivering under the weight of decades of silence, and exhaling the memories of its victims. The corridor stretched endlessly, as if it had extended itself overnight, warping in angles and dimensions that should have been impossible. The flickering gas lamps cast grotesque shadows, merging patience with walls, merging memory with structure. Every step echoed, but not in uniform rhythm. It bounced, rebounded, and whispered of corners that did not exist yesterday. Blackwood's boots made no sound on the warped floorboards, yet I could feel the vibration of his presence, as though the building itself acknowledged his authority. His long coat, dark and precise, rippled slightly with each movement. The faint scent of tobacco lingered in his wake, mingling with the antiseptic and the metallic tang of old blood. He paused,
eyes scanning the walls, taking in the subtle stains, scratches, and forgotten marks, each a narrative of suffering and suppressed rebellion. Clara clutched my arm. Her knuckles were pale, pressing hard into the fabric of my sleeve. "It's too quiet here now," she whispered. But the quiet was deceptive. It roared beneath the surface, a subterranean river of whispers, mutters, and soft footsteps that refused to be hushed. A sudden crash echoed from Ward 3, the sound of wood splintering, chairs overturned, and a metallic clang that resonated with unnerving precision. A man ran past us, naked from the waist up, hands clawing at the air as though the very walls were trying to catch him. "They're talking!" he cried. "They're all talking!" Blackwood placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "They always were," he said. "You simply stopped listening." The man wrenched free and fled. Monroe turned slowly in place, as though surveying the ruins of a cathedral only he had believed eternal. "I saved them! I spared them chaos!" Blackwood stepped closer. "No," he said gently. "You spared yourself descent." From the far end of the corridor came a voice unlike the others. Clear, measured, educated. "Dr. Monroe!" it called. We all turned. An elderly man stood framed in a doorway marked Ward 0. He was tall still, despite age. His posture bore the memory of authority. His hair was white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes burned with unbroken intellect. "I was a barrister," he said calmly. "You kept me for 4 months, longer than your projections allowed." He smiled thinly. "I spent that time rehearsing." Monroe's lips parted. "You cannot testify," he said weakly. "Your records—" "Were falsified," the man finished. "Yes, you taught me the value of repetition." He took one step forward. "So, I repeated myself." The lights went out. For one terrible heartbeat,
Every page seemed to breathe, alive with the echo of screams that had never been silenced. Blackwood bent closer. Each entry revealed the mastermind's obsession with human fragility. Patient 17. Refused food for 14 days. Hallucinations of shadowy figures with elongated fingers. Patient 29. Coerced into confessing crimes never committed. Psychological collapse after 3 nights of solitary confinement. Patient 46. Secret diary discovered. Entries describing a mysterious overseer watching from the shadows. Not a guard, not a doctor, but something else entirely. Clara's lips trembled as she read aloud. The eyes follow, the walls listen, and the mind breaks quietly. From somewhere deep in the asylum, a low rumble began, almost imperceptible at first. Then it grew louder, reverberating through the floor and walls. The patients stirred, not aimlessly, but with a coordinated awareness, as if the ledger itself had awakened them. Their murmurs merged into a low, ominous chant, the cadence rhythmic and almost hypnotic. The ledger knows. He watches still. Silence is his companion. The mastermind emerged from the shadows, his coat flowing like liquid darkness, his eyes reflecting the faint light of the ledger. "You meddle where you should not," he said, voice like silk drawn across steel. "That book contains truths the world is not ready for, every name, every weakness, preserved for eternity. You will never understand the patterns I have observed." Blackwood stepped forward, eyes locked on the figure. "Patterns," he said, voice calm but sharp as a scalpel, "are meaningless when the truth is revealed. The ledger is not yours to command. Every secret it contains is now exposed." A sudden clanging of iron chains burst from the walls. The patients surged forward, freed from their confinement by some unseen mechanism. The air was filled with the metallic tang of fear and adrenaline, the sound echoing like war drums. The mastermind raised his hands in vain. His control over the asylum began to slip, the walls themselves seeming to contract and pulse against him. The building groaned, stone grinding on stone, dust falling like fine ash. Shadows twisted into grotesque shapes along the corridors, and the gas lamps flickered violently. For the first time, the mastermind was confronted by chaos he could not dominate. Clara raised the ledger above her head, shouting over the cacophony, "Blackwood, the ledger! We can use it!" Blackwood understood instantly. The ledger contained all the keys, hidden passages, the locations of secret locks, and the psychological triggers the mastermind had used on the patients. With a swift motion, he directed Harrington to call out the patient codes in order, each word resonating with the subtle control the mastermind had exerted. The effect was immediate. Patients previously riled into frenzy began to respond to the ledger's instructions, their movements precise, almost ritualistic. The corridors became a dance of liberation and retribution, with the mastermind at the center, flailing against forces he thought he controlled. "Do you see?" shouted Blackwood to the mastermind, advancing step by step. "Control is an illusion. You thought you were omnipotent, but the ledger belongs to the truth, and the truth always finds a way." The mastermind's eyes widened, his carefully constructed calm shattered. For the first time, fear touched him, sharp and unrelenting. The walls themselves seemed to press inward, the patient's chants growing louder, synchronized with the building's eerie groans. Harrington, recovering his composure, grabbed a fallen lantern. Its light revealed the mastermind's face fully, lines of obsession, of meticulous planning, but now distorted by panic and disbelief. His hands, once steady instruments of terror, trembled as the walls seemed to close in around him. The asylum seemed to breathe. Each wall, corridor, and cell pulsed with the weight of decades of suffering, as though the very building had taken a side. The gas lamps flickered in eerie rhythm, throwing long, distorted shadows that crawled like living things along the cracked plaster. Blackwood's boots made no sound on the damp stone floors, but the echoes of the patients' low chants reverberated through the hallways like an ominous drumbeat. At the heart of the asylum, in the grand observation hall, the mastermind waited. He stood beneath a rotting skylight, through which a thin beam of moonlight pierced the darkness, illuminating his gaunt, angular face. His eyes, sharp and calculating, glinted with cold amusement, but beneath it flickered the first trace of doubt. Blackwood stepped forward, hands relaxed but ready, eyes fixed on the figure. "Your games end tonight," he said, voice steady, carrying easily across the hall. "The ledger does not belong to you. The patients do not belong to you. The truth is not your property." The mastermind's lips curled in a sneer. "Ah, Mr. Blackwood, always precise, always confident, but you have walked into a trap of your own ignorance. The asylum bends to my will, the ledger obeys my commands, and the chaos around you is of my design." Harrington, standing slightly behind, adjusted his spectacles. His hands shook with a mixture of fear and determination. "Abraham, look!" He pointed to the shadows along the walls, where the patients, previously disorganized, now stood like silent sentinels. Their eyes glimmered in the faint light. Hunger, fear, and newfound resolve mirrored in their gaze. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. He understood immediately. The ledger had activated their memory of past cruelty, but now it could be used to guide them, to turn their chaos into precision. He lifted his hand, signaling Clara to read aloud the ledger's instructions, the names of corridors, secret passages, and specific actions the patients were to perform. As her voice echoed through the hall, the mastermind's confident demeanor began to crack. The patients moved with almost preternatural coordination. Doors slammed behind him, windows rattled as if gripped by invisible hands, and the gas lamps flickered violently, casting grotesque, writhing shadows across his face. "You cannot control what you have enslaved," said Blackwood, advancing another step. "Fear, torment, and silence, they may bend minds for a while, but they break the soul. And now, your soul is exposed." The mastermind's voice rose, shrill and commanding. "Stop them! They must obey me! The ledger is mine!" But the words sounded hollow, swallowed by the growing chorus of chants and footsteps. The walls seemed to pulse in response, groaning and creaking as if the building itself had turned against him. Blackwood moved closer, each step measured, deliberate. The moonlight illuminated the ledger in Clara's hands, its pages glowing faintly, as though revealing hidden sigils that had been invisible to the eye. The mastermind's days flickered nervously. He had seen the ledger's power, but he had never expected it to be turned against him. A sudden metallic clang echoed from the upper gallery. Chains, long forgotten and corroded with rust, crashed to the floor. The patients surged forward, not in mindless frenzy, but with the purpose of liberation and justice, their voices rising into a crescendo that shook the rafters. The mastermind backed towards the center of the hall, panic overtaking calculation. "This is impossible! I control everything!" he screamed, eyes darting wildly as shadows twisted and lunged. Blackwood's gaze was unwavering. "Control is an illusion," he said. "You mistake fear for power, silence for authority, and cruelty for genius. None of it can withstand the light of truth." The patients moved as one, forming a living barrier around the mastermind. Clara held the ledger aloft, and as the beam of moonlight struck it, the pages seemed to flare with an inner fire, illuminating the room with a spectral glow. The mastermind screamed as the ledger's revelations exposed every crime, every deception, every act of tyranny he had committed. Then, in a final desperate gesture, he lunged towards Blackwood, but the floor beneath him gave way. A rotting section of the wooden platform collapsed under his weight, and he fell into the shadows below, disappearing into a pit of his own design, a twisted tomb of the asylum's forgotten horrors. The patients stood silent, breathing heavily, the tension in their bodies slowly unwinding. Blackwood approached, placing a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "It is over," he said, though his voice carried the weight of everything they had witnessed. Harrington exhaled, finally allowing himself to shake. Over, but at what cost? Blackwood glanced around the hall. The asylum, now still but for the faint groan of settling walls, seemed almost alive, as if it had witnessed justice done. "At the cost of truth," he replied, "and of courage." Clara closed the ledger, her hands trembling, eyes...
Clara closed the ledger, her hands trembling, eyes wide with realization. The names, the secrets, they're all here. He thought he owned them, but we are the keepers now, Blackwood finished, his voice calm but resolute, and the world will know the truth in due time. The Silent Asylum, once a place of whispered terror and unseen cruelty, now lay quiet, its secrets preserved, but its horrors unveiled. And as the first faint light of dawn crept through the broken skylight, Blackwood, Harrington, and Clara knew that the ledger had not only saved lives, but revealed the darkest corners of the human soul. The dawn had begun to spill weak silver light through the fractured skylights of the asylum. Dust motes swirled like tiny specters in the beams, and the air carried the faint tang of rust, mold, and antiseptic, reminders of 100 years of suffering contained within these walls. Blackwood leaned against the cold stone balustrade, the ledger open before him.
Its pages, once feared for the power they seemed to grant the asylum's tyrant, now radiated a strange clarity. Every name, every mark of cruelty, every dark secret that had tormented lives was laid bare, yet not with malice, but with the potential for redemption. Harrington, pale but composed, whispered, "I never thought a book could hold so much of the human soul." His fingers traced one of the ledger's entries, a name smudged by time, a record of betrayal and silence. All this cruelty could have continued, hidden, if not for your courage, Abraham. Blackwood closed the ledger slowly, his eyes scanning the broken windows where the first birds of morning fluttered in. "It isn't courage alone, David. It's understanding. The ledger, the asylum, it forced me to see something I had only glimpsed in fragments before, that evil does not exist in isolation. It thrives in silence, in neglect, in the spaces between words where conscience hesitates." Clara, holding the ledger close, shivered, a mixture of fear and awe in her eyes. So all the suffering, the patience, it wasn't meaningless? Blackwood's gaze softened. No, it was not meaningless. It was a mirror of every lie, every act of selfishness, every cruelty we choose to ignore. And in facing it, in confronting it, truth becomes light, and light clears even the darkest halls. Harrington nodded slowly, comprehension dawning. We always think of justice as the law, as punishment, but this ledger, it is justice in its purest form, recognition, exposure, a chance for the world and ourselves to see clearly. Blackwood's eyes, for the first time since they entered the asylum, reflected a kind of quiet wonder. All my life, I have pursued criminals, mysteries, riddles, thinking that the act of catching them was the pinnacle. But now, I realize the real victory lies in revelation, in truth, in understanding the human heart, even its darkest corners. Tonight, I saw it laid bare. Clara's voice trembled. And the mastermind, he thought himself clever, untouchable, but he underestimated everything. Not just us, not just the patients, but the very nature of truth itself. Blackwood nodded, closing the ledger with a deliberate, final motion. The room seemed to sigh along with him, as if the asylum itself acknowledged the moment. Evil can manipulate, deceive, control, but it cannot escape truth, not when the light of observation and reason reaches it. That is the lesson the ledger has taught us. For a long moment, the three of them stood in silence, absorbing the weight of what had transpired. The epiphany was not just about the mastermind's downfall, nor the liberation of the patients. It was about seeing the invisible threads that connect actions to consequence, cruelty to courage, silence to revelation. And in that quiet dawn, with the first rays falling upon their faces, Abraham Jonathan Blackwood understood. The mind that sees clearly, the heart that seeks justice, and the courage to act, together are unstoppable. The ledger had done more than record crimes. It had illuminated the essence of humanity, and in that illumination lay the promise of redemption for both the victims and those who had once walked the shadowed halls of the Silent Asylum.